In the quiet of the night, the sky becomes a sea of lights, cities glowing below, stars flickering above, and somewhere in between, a runway waiting to be found. Pilots trust those lights with their lives, but when one of them is wrong, when a single reflection or a misplaced beacon leads the way, everything can change in an instant. In this video, we uncover the real stories of flights that lined up on the wrong path. Moments when confusion, darkness, and human error turned precision into tragedy. If you want to keep exploring the hidden side of aviation with us, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. It truly helps us continue bringing you these stories where every second and every light mattered. It was the night of October 31st, 2000. A violent typhoon swept over Taipei, turning the airfield into a maze of rain and reflection. On that night, Singapore Airlines Flight 006, a Boeing 747, prepared for departure to Los Angeles with a stop in Singapore. The crew had flown this route countless times before. They knew the airport, they trusted their procedures, and despite the storm, everything seemed routine. But on the ground, in the middle of the night, routine is often an illusion. The rain fell so hard that visibility dropped to almost nothing. The pilots could barely see the taxiway markings, and the windshield was streaked with light and water. On their charts, two parallel runways stood side by side, one active, one closed for construction. Between them, a narrow stretch of asphalt led directly into danger. The flight was cleared for takeoff from runway 05 left, but in the confusion of lights and reflections, the jet lined up instead with runway 05 right, a closed surface littered with cranes, concrete barriers, and equipment. In the cockpit, the crew completed their final checklist. Wind gusts reached 50 knots. The captain advanced the throttles, the four engines roared to life, and the giant aircraft began accelerating down the dark, rain-soaked surface. The speed built quickly, 80 knots, 100, 120. Then, out of the darkness, a shape appeared ahead. A moment of disbelief. It wasn't supposed to be there. A split second later, the 747 struck the heavy machinery spread across the closed runway. The sound was deafening. A flash of light, a burst of flame, and then silence broken only by the rain. The aircraft split apart, the fuselage engulfed in fire. 58 people lost their lives that night, but many others survived, thanks to the bravery of passengers and crew who fought their way through smoke and debris to escape into the storm. Investigators later found that the runway markings were partially obscured by rain and construction barriers. The closure signs were small and unlit, invisible against the storm. Inside the cockpit, the pressure was immense. Heavy weather, fatigue, and the stress of operating under time limits all combined into a perfect storm of human error. The official report concluded that the crew mistook the closed runway for the active one due to inadequate signage and poor visibility. In the aftermath, airports around the world changed the way they mark and light closed runways. New standards were introduced for barricades, warning lights, and ground radar systems. Singapore Airlines also overhauled its cockpit communication and night departure procedures, ensuring that cross-verification between pilots became mandatory before takeoff clearance was accepted. The Taipei disaster became a painful reminder that even the most advanced aircraft, in the hands of skilled pilots, are still vulnerable when visibility disappears and assumptions take over. On that stormy Halloween night, one of the safest airlines in the world faced the ultimate truth of aviation. No matter how powerful the machine, it all begins with one human decision and one wrong light. It was just before dawn, on August 27, 2006, when Comair Flight 5191 prepared to depart from Lexington's Bluegrass Airport in Kentucky. The regional jet, a Bombardier CRJ-100, sat quietly at the gate as passengers boarded under the dim orange glow of the terminal lights. The flight was short, a routine trip to Atlanta, and the air was still, the sky painted in shades of early blue. But in the calm of that morning, a single mistake was already forming, hidden beneath a layer of routine and human fatigue. Captain Jeffrey Clay was in command that day, a 35-year-old pilot with over 3,000 flight hours. Beside him sat First Officer James Polhinky, who would be the pilot flying. Both men had arrived early, completed their pre-flight checks, and briefed the weather. Everything appeared normal. The aircraft was cleared for takeoff on runway 22, the main runway, long, wide, and familiar. But overnight, the airport had undergone a subtle change. Construction had altered the taxiways, and markings had shifted. The shorter runway 26, unlit, half the length, and unsuitable for jets, sat only a few hundred feet away. In the pre-dawn darkness, the difference was almost invisible. At 5:56 a.m., the CRJ pushed back and began taxiing toward the runway. The air traffic controller, working alone, cleared them for takeoff on runway 22. He couldn't see the aircraft from the tower because of a blind spot caused by the terminal and low light. Inside the cockpit, both pilots taxied through the maze of taxiways. They should have turned right onto the main runway, but instead they followed the wrong taxiway and lined up with runway 26. The cockpit voice recorder captured the tone of their conversation, casual, even relaxed. They discussed hotels, weekend plans, small talk, the kind of chatter that fills the silence of early morning flights. It was a calm that hid a critical oversight. Neither pilot performed the full runway verification call-out. Both assumed they were where they should be. The lights outside looked normal, the taxiway signs blurred by darkness. There was no illuminated center line, no signs of the longer runway ahead, yet nothing felt wrong. At 5:59, the captain said, "All right, let's go." The engines roared to life, and the aircraft began its takeoff roll. The sound of acceleration filled the cabin as the plane surged down the runway. In the tower, the controller turned away for a moment. He was handling paperwork, unaware that the jet was on the wrong strip of asphalt. Within seconds, the first officer realized something wasn't right. The runway felt short. The lights ended too soon. The end of the pavement rushed toward them faster than expected. The engines screamed as the first officer pulled back on the yoke, but the aircraft never reached the speed needed for flight. The jet lifted briefly, just enough for the landing gear to leave the ground before striking a berm and bursting through a perimeter fence. The right wing hit trees, and the aircraft exploded into flames in a nearby field. 49 of the 50 people on board were killed instantly. The only survivor was First Officer Polhinky, who was critically injured. In the aftermath, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived to find the runway markings clear. The crew had taken off from runway 26. Only 3,500 feet long, far too short for the CRJ at its takeoff weight. On runway 22, where they were supposed to be, the length was over 7,000 feet, more than enough for a safe departure. The NTSB report painted a haunting picture of how small errors align. The crew had followed the wrong taxiway because of poor lighting and confusing construction. The controller, working alone, was performing dual duties, ground and tower, and was unable to monitor the aircraft visually. The pilots, distracted by non-essential conversation, skipped a crucial checklist step, confirming the runway heading on their instruments. But deeper than the procedural failures was the human factor: fatigue, complacency, and trust in familiarity. The captain had flown out of Lexington dozens of times before. The first officer was new but confident. Both had assumed the environment hadn't changed. The brain, when tired, looks for patterns, and that morning, it found one where none existed. The tragedy led to sweeping reforms in cockpit discipline and airport design. The FAA reinforced strict adherence to sterile cockpit procedures, banning casual conversation below 10,000 feet or during critical phases of flight. Runway verification, confirming heading alignment with the runway number, became mandatory before every takeoff. Airports were required to improve taxiway lighting, markings, and signage, especially at intersections where similar runways could cause confusion. The families of the victims later said the hardest part was knowing how ordinary that morning had been. Passengers had smiled, crew members had laughed, and within moments, all of it was gone. It was not a storm, not a failure of machinery, just the smallest lapse of attention in the most ordinary of moments. Today, pilots still reference Comair Flight 5191 in human factors training. It serves as a warning that aviation's greatest threats rarely come from the sky. They come from the quiet moments when everything feels routine. On that August morning, the lights of the wrong runway looked almost identical to the right one, and in aviation, almost is never enough. It was the night of August 6, 1997. The island of Guam was wrapped in darkness, its coastline illuminated only by the dim lights of villages scattered along the hills. Far above, Korean Air Flight 801, a Boeing 747, descended through thick clouds, approaching from Seoul with 254 people on board. It was supposed to be an uneventful night flight, one the airline had completed hundreds of times before. But as the aircraft neared the island, a small chain of misunderstandings began, quiet, unnoticed, and irreversible. The flight crew had been in the air for more than 4 hours. They were tired but focused, descending toward the island's single main runway. The weather was poor, low clouds, heavy rain, and limited visibility. The approach procedure into Guam required the use of an essential navigational aid known as the glide slope, which helps pilots maintain the correct descent angle toward the runway. That night, the glide slope was out of service for maintenance. Air traffic control had informed the crew, but in the haze of routine, the absence of that signal would become the heart of the tragedy. As Flight 801 approached, Captain Park Yong-chul, an experienced pilot with over 9,000 hours of flight time, briefed the approach. His plan was to use a non-precision approach, relying on distance readings and altitude checks instead of the automated glide path. The first officer and flight engineer followed along, reading instruments, monitoring the weather radar, and verifying distances from the VOR beacon. Everything seemed correct. The descent rate, the course, the speed. But below the clouds, the island's hilly terrain hid a deadly illusion. At 3:20 a.m., the controller cleared the flight to land. The pilots expected to break out of the clouds and see the runway lights ahead. But as they descended through 2,000 feet, the cockpit was still surrounded by darkness. The captain, believing they were closer to the airport than they were, called for the final descent. The altimeter showed that they were higher than the minimum descent altitude, but he continued down. "Check the runway in sight," he said. The first officer looked out into the blackness. "Not yet, sir." Seconds later, the ground proximity warning system called out its first alert. "Too low. Terrain." The captain hesitated. He thought it was a false alarm that the system was reacting to nearby hills. He continued descending. A few seconds later, the warning grew louder. "Pull up! Pull up!" The flight engineer shouted the same words, but by the time the captain pulled back on the controls, it was too late. At 3:21 a.m., the massive Boeing 747 struck Nimitz Hill, a densely forested ridge 3 miles short of the runway. The aircraft broke apart and burst into flames. 228 people lost their lives. Only 26 survived, many rescued by local residents who climbed the hill in the rain, guided by screams and flashes of fire through the dark. In the days that followed, the crash site became a field of wreckage and sorrow. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived to piece together the final minutes. The cockpit voice recorder revealed confusion, fatigue, and subtle pressure inside the cockpit. The captain had misread the altitude-distance relationship, assuming they were much closer to the runway than they were. The first officer, though aware of inconsistencies, hesitated to challenge his superior directly, a cultural barrier common in hierarchical flight decks of that era. The NTSB concluded that the primary cause of the accident was controlled flight into terrain, an entirely preventable crash caused by situational awareness loss and misjudgment of altitude. Contributing factors included fatigue, poor communication, and the deactivated glide slope system. The report also noted that Korean Air's training culture emphasized authority and obedience more than cross-verification, a pattern that had led to other incidents in the airline's history. The tragedy reshaped Korean Air from the ground up. The airline launched a massive reform effort, hiring foreign training consultants, overhauling cockpit culture, and implementing strict crew resource management practices. Pilots were retrained to question, verify, and communicate without fear of hierarchy. The airline's transformation became a model case for how cultural and procedural change can rebuild safety from within. For aviation as a whole, Flight 801 marked a turning point in the understanding of visual illusion and night approach risk. Guam's airport soon installed an advanced terrain awareness and warning system, and new regulations required all large aircraft to be equipped with it. This system, unlike the older one, shows pilots a 3D terrain map in real time, making it nearly impossible to repeat such a mistake. For the survivors, the night of August 6th remains a memory of confusion and courage. Some described crawling out of burning wreckage, disoriented by rain and smoke, hearing others cry out in the darkness. One survivor said, "We thought we had landed. We didn't know we were on a mountain." In aviation, darkness plays tricks even on the most skilled eyes. The absence of a single signal, the misreading of a single light, can turn confidence into catastrophe. Flight 801 stands as a reminder that no matter how advanced the systems become, the human mind remains the weakest and strongest instrument in the sky. It was New Year's Day, 1978. Mumbai's night sky was cloudless, the city shimmering below in thousands of lights that blended into the Arabian Sea. Air India Flight 855, a Boeing 747 named Emperor Ashoka, prepared to depart for Dubai. The crew was experienced Captain Madan Lal Kukar, a veteran pilot with over 18,000 hours in the air, First Officer Indu Virmani, and Flight Engineer Alfredo Faria. The passengers were relaxed, many heading to the Gulf for work or to reunite with family. The takeoff, at first, seemed perfectly ordinary. At 8 minutes past 8, the aircraft lifted off from runway 27, climbing steadily into the night. Inside the cockpit, everything looked normal. The climb rate, the engine readings, the horizon lights outside. But within moments, the calm rhythm of departure turned into quiet confusion. As the aircraft left the lights of Mumbai behind, it entered complete darkness over the Arabian Sea. The sky and the ocean blended into one black mass. For a few seconds, the pilots had no visible reference to the horizon. This is where the human brain begins to fail, a phenomenon known as spatial disorientation. When there's no external visual reference, the inner ear can't tell up from down, leading pilots to sense a climb when they're actually descending, or a turn when they're flying straight. Captain Kukar, relying on what he thought he saw outside, believed the aircraft was banking to the right. He instinctively corrected with a left roll, unaware that the instruments were still showing level flight. The first officer, monitoring the instruments, noticed the left bank increasing and warned the captain, but the warning came too late, and the captain believed his instruments were malfunctioning. Seconds later, the artificial horizon, the key flight instrument that indicates pitch and roll, began showing a left bank. The captain, now convinced that this was false, dismissed it as an electrical fault. In reality, it was correct. The airplane was rolling further left, its nose gradually dropping. The flight engineer, watching the altimeter, saw the numbers falling fast. He called out, "We're losing altitude!" But the confusion in the cockpit deepened. The captain pulled back on the control column, thinking the plane was climbing too steeply. The Boeing's nose lifted momentarily, then dropped even further. The altimeter continued to unwind. Within seconds, the aircraft entered a steep, uncontrolled left roll. At 8 minutes and 10 seconds after takeoff, the 747 plunged into the Arabian Sea. The impact was catastrophic. All 213 people on board were lost. In the investigation that followed, Indian authorities pieced together the final minutes from air traffic control recordings and instrument debris recovered from the sea. They discovered that the primary cause was spatial disorientation triggered by loss of visual reference, followed by misinterpretation of instrument readings. The captain's failure to trust his instruments, combined with a possible failure of the attitude indicator on his side, created an irreversible chain of confusion. The report also revealed that fatigue and the limited cockpit resource management culture of the 1,970 seconds contributed to the tragedy. The first officer, despite noticing the role, may have hesitated to assert control due to cockpit hierarchy. It was an era when captains were rarely questioned, even in moments of doubt. The loss of Flight 855 reshaped India's approach to flight training. It led to new simulator programs designed specifically to teach instrument reliance and spatial orientation recovery. Airlines began emphasizing crew cross-verification, ensuring that any disagreement between visual and instrument readings triggered immediate instrument trust procedures. The tragedy also became one of the earliest case studies in human factors within aviation, proof that experience alone isn't protection against the illusions of the night sky. Pilots are trained to believe the instruments, not your instincts. Yet, when the world outside turns black, that's one of the hardest things to do. For the families waiting in Dubai that night, the loss was sudden and absolute. No distress call, no warning, only silence. For the aviation world, it was a turning point. The accident remains one of the most haunting examples of how even the most skilled pilots can lose the battle against nature's simplest trick, the darkness between the sea and the sky. It reminded every aviator that technology can fail, training can lapse, and instinct can mislead, but the instruments never lie. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the skies over the eastern United States were filled with hundreds of commercial flights, following routine schedules, among them Delta Airlines Flight 1989, a Boeing 767 departing Boston for Los Angeles. To the crew, it was a normal cross-country flight. To air traffic controllers, it soon became a name that would echo through the chaos of that morning, a flight mistakenly believed to have been hijacked, caught in the confusion of history's darkest day in aviation. The day began calmly. Flight 1989 took off at 8:05 a.m., just minutes after American Airlines Flight 11, the first aircraft that would later strike the North Tower. The two jets were similar, both Boeing widebodies, both leaving Boston for Los Angeles, both climbing westbound across the same air corridors. Their radar tracks and transponder codes appeared nearly identical to controllers overwhelmed with dozens of moving targets. As news of the first crash reached the Federal Aviation Administration, confusion spread through every control center in the Northeast. Air traffic controllers, military radar operators, and airline dispatchers tried desperately to piece together which aircraft were still under control and which were not. Then a call came through. Another plane, United Flight 175, had turned toward New York. Minutes later, it disappeared into the South Tower. At that exact moment, controllers in Cleveland began to lose contact with multiple aircraft crossing their airspace. Some transponders were turned off, others transmitted irregularly. One of them was Flight 93, which had been hijacked. Another, still communicating normally, was Delta 1989, but the similarities were too close for comfort. The crew of Delta 1989 had no idea what was happening. They were flying calmly at 31,000 feet, talking to air traffic control, maintaining all proper communications. But from the ground, their radar signature matched the profile of a hijacked aircraft. Same departure airport, same destination, similar type. Within minutes, their flight was flagged by the FAA as potentially compromised. Fighter jets were alerted. Conflicting reports claimed that a Delta flight was missing, that it might be headed toward Washington. Inside the cockpit, the crew received a call from dispatch. "We need you to land immediately." There was no explanation, only urgency. The pilots, following procedure, declared an emergency and requested clearance to divert. Controllers, unsure whether the aircraft was friendly or hostile, guided them toward Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, though even that decision was clouded with uncertainty. Other reports suggested they might be heading toward Detroit or even Toledo. As the jet began descending, the tension in the control room reached its peak. Controllers monitored every move, their voices rising with fear and confusion. For a few moments, radio chatter overlapped questions, instructions, fragments of disbelief. Delta 1989, confirm your intentions. The pilot's calm voice came back. This is Delta 1989. We're diverting to Cleveland, landing immediately. It was the first real proof that the aircraft was still under control. At 10:12 a.m., the Boeing 767 touched down safely in Cleveland. Armed police surrounded the aircraft as it rolled to a stop on the taxiway. Passengers were ordered to remain seated as officers boarded, searching for any sign of danger. There was none. The flight had never been hijacked. Every passenger was accounted for, every crew member unharmed. Yet for nearly an hour, the world believed it might be another weapon in the air. The aftermath of that morning revealed the scale of communication collapse. The FAA and NORAD systems had been overwhelmed by conflicting data, inaccurate reports, and overlapping radar signals. Delta Flight 1989 became a case study in how chaos, not malice, can fuel confusion during crises. The crew's composure and discipline, their calm responses amid national panic, prevented further escalation. Afterward, investigators from the 9/11 Commission reviewed every radio call, every radar sweep, and every decision made during those frantic minutes. They concluded that misidentification and incomplete information had led to the false hijack alert. No fault was found with the pilots or controllers, only the reality that, in the fog of fear, the human mind connects dots that were never meant to align. For passengers on board, the experience was surreal. When they finally disembarked, they were met with news of the attacks, unaware that, for a short time, the world had thought they were part of it. Many broke down in disbelief. They had been flying in clear skies, unaware that history was unfolding beneath them. Today, Delta Flight 1989 is remembered not for tragedy, but for clarity amid chaos. It exposed the gaps in communication between military and civilian controllers, prompting new, real-time coordination systems that allow both sides to share aircraft data instantly. It also underscored the importance of precise, verified communication in aviation, the difference between fear and fact. In the hours that followed, the U.S. airspace was closed entirely, grounding thousands of aircraft for the first time in history. Delta 1989 became one of the last to land before the silence took over a flight that symbolized how misunderstanding, not malfunction, can turn an ordinary morning into a legend of confusion. In the end, it wasn't an act of violence that threatened Flight 1989. It was a reflection of how fragile our systems can be when the unthinkable happens. The lesson it left behind remains timeless. In aviation, clarity isn't just safety, it's survival. It was the night of July 7th, 2017, at San Francisco International Airport. The sky was clear, the air calm, one of those perfect California nights when everything seems routine. Air Canada Flight 759, an Airbus A320 from Toronto, was cleared to land on runway 28 right just before midnight. It was a short, familiar flight for the crew until routine turned into one of the closest near disasters in aviation history. The two pilots, both experienced, had been flying for over 4 hours. Fatigue was quietly setting in, not exhaustion, but the subtle fog that blurs judgment after a long day. Air traffic was heavy that night, as it often is at San Francisco. On the ground, 4 fully loaded airliners from United, Philippine Airlines, and others waited nose to tail on taxiway C, parallel to the landing runway. From above, under the bright glow of airport lights, The two strips of pavement looked nearly identical. At 11:56 p.m., the controller cleared Air Canada 759 to land on runway 28 right. The captain, flying manually, acknowledged. The crew descended through 5,000 feet, then 4,000, entering the final approach. Everything appeared normal. The approach was stable, the descent smooth. But outside, something was off. The crew saw lights ahead, but they were not aligned with the runway. They were looking at the taxiway. Runway 28 left. The parallel runway was closed that night for construction. Its lights were turned off, leaving only one runway illuminated. The taxiway beside it, however, was lit and lined with aircraft waiting to depart. To the fatigued eyes of the Air Canada crew, that line of aircraft looked like runway edge lighting. The captain lined up perfectly, but with the wrong surface. As the Airbus descended through 200 feet, one of the pilots remarked, "Looks like there are lights on the runway." The first officer agreed, his tone uncertain. In the tower, the controller was handling multiple aircraft and didn't immediately see the misalignment. Then, at about 100 feet above the ground, the radio crackled. A startled voice from one of the planes waiting below. "Where's this guy going? He's on the taxiway!" At that moment, the Air Canada jet passed directly over the first waiting aircraft, a United Boeing 767, missing it by less than 14 feet. Pilots on the ground shouted into their microphones, warning the tower and each other. The Air Canada captain, realizing his mistake at the last possible second, pushed the throttle forward and initiated a go-around. The engines roared as the Airbus climbed back into the night sky, barely clearing the lineup of jets below. For several seconds, the frequency was filled with overlapping voices, confusion, alarm, disbelief. The controller, now fully aware of what had just happened, ordered the go-around confirmed and cleared all aircraft from the taxiway. The Air Canada crew, shaken but calm, circled back for another approach, this time landing safely on the correct runway. When the NTSB investigated, they found that the Airbus had come within 5 seconds of one of the worst aviation disasters in history. If the go-around had been delayed by even 2 seconds, the aircraft's landing gear would have struck the tail of a waiting jet, setting off a chain explosion involving multiple, fully fueled aircraft. Over 1,000 lives could have been lost in an instant, all captured on cockpit voice recordings and tower audio. The NTSB's final report revealed a chilling combination of factors: fatigue, visual illusion, lighting confusion, and lack of cross-verification. The crew had been awake for over 19 hours, their circadian rhythms disrupted by time zone shifts. The closed runway's absence of lighting, combined with the bright taxiway illumination, created a misleading visual pattern known as a black hole illusion, a phenomenon that tricks pilots into misjudging distance and alignment in low-light conditions. Compounding the issue, San Francisco's approach design placed the taxiway and runway unusually close together, making misidentification easier from the air. And because the Airbus was flying visually in clear weather, the pilots were relying on sight, not instruments, during the final moments. Following the incident, the FAA and Transport Canada launched multiple safety reforms. The most immediate was a new runway status light system, designed to better distinguish active runways from taxiways at night. Airports began reviewing lighting configurations, especially where parallel taxiways exist near active runways. The FAA also issued stronger guidelines for pilot fatigue management and visual approach training, emphasizing the need to confirm runway alignment using the primary flight display before landing clearance is executed. The crew of Air Canada 759 faced scrutiny, but investigators acknowledged the psychological and environmental traps that led to the mistake. In the end, their quick go-around decision was the reason the event remained a near miss instead of a disaster. In simulator training today, this incident is replayed worldwide as an example of how even the most experienced pilots can be misled by what they see, and how the difference between a safe landing and catastrophe can be a few feet, a few seconds, and a single flicker of light. As one investigator later said, if there was ever a night when luck had wings, it was that one. It was May 24th, 1988, a humid spring afternoon over the Gulf of Mexico. Taca Flight 110, a Boeing 737, had departed Belize City en route to New Orleans, carrying 38 passengers and 7 crew members. The weather forecast warned of isolated thunderstorms, but nothing out of the ordinary. Captain Carlos Dardano, a young yet remarkably experienced pilot from El Salvador, was at the controls. He had already survived being shot down once during the civil unrest in his home country, and that experience, unknowingly, had prepared him for what would soon unfold. As the aircraft approached the Louisiana coastline, towering storm clouds rose ahead. The crew decided to navigate through what appeared to be a gap in the line of storms. On radar, it looked manageable, light precipitation, minimal turbulence. But weather radar, like all technology, has limits. Heavy rain can sometimes absorb and hide the most dangerous cells. What looked like a gap was in fact the heart of a developing thunderstorm. Within minutes, Taca 110 entered a wall of rain and hail so dense that visibility vanished completely. The wind howled, the aircraft shook violently, and the rain on the windshield sounded like thousands of pebbles striking metal. Lightning flashed across the sky. Then, the first engine spooled down. The left engine's flame went out, choked by water ingestion. Seconds later, the right engine followed. Both engines had flamed out. Inside the cockpit, a surreal silence replaced the roar of jet thrust. The only sounds were the rain and the calm but urgent voices of the crew. The Boeing 737 had become a glider, descending rapidly through the storm. Captain Dardano and First Officer Dionisio Lopez worked quickly through the restart checklist. The auxiliary power unit was activated. Attempts were made to relight both engines, but the dense moisture and low altitude left no time. The engines refused to reignite. At 3,000 feet, they broke out of the clouds. Below them stretched a patchwork of swamp, water, and grass fields, no airports in sight. They had less than 3 minutes before impact. The nearest runway, New Orleans International, was too far. They called air traffic control. "Mayday, mayday, both engines out," unable to reach the airport. Dardano took manual control, scanning the horizon for anything flat and solid. Then he spotted a narrow strip of green, about 2,000 feet long, beside the NASA Michoud assembly facility, where parts of the space shuttle were built. It wasn't a runway. It was a grassy levee between 2 drainage canals. But it was their only chance. The approach was textbook. With no engine power, every movement of the control yoke was deliberate and smooth. The captain extended the landing gear using gravity alone, then deployed the flaps for lift. The crew called out airspeed, 120 knots, 110, 100. At less than 50 feet, the ground rushed up. The Boeing touched down on the grass, bounced once, and rolled to a stop between the canals, perfectly centered, wings level. Not a single life was lost. After the landing, the crew calmly evacuated the passengers. Firefighters and emergency crews, expecting a crash site, were stunned to find the jet sitting intact, engines silent, fuselage unbroken, passengers standing in the grass. Photos from that day show the aircraft surrounded by green fields and industrial buildings, an impossible sight. A commercial airliner resting in a place never meant for one. When Boeing engineers later examined the aircraft, they confirmed that both engines had ingested massive amounts of water and hail, extinguishing combustion. The weather cell was later classified as one of the most intense microburst zones ever recorded in the region. The engines were found structurally intact, but evidence showed compressor stalls and water impact damage deep inside. What made the event extraordinary was not just the dual flameout, it was the flawless decision-making under total failure. Captain Dardano's situational awareness, combined with his understanding of the aircraft's glide capabilities, turned what should have been a catastrophe into one of aviation's greatest saves. The NTSB praised the crew for their extraordinary airmanship and credited their training and teamwork. Boeing engineers used the event as a real-world case study for engine water ingestion tolerance, later redesigning several components and drainage systems to prevent recurrence. The FAA introduced improved standards for weather radar interpretation and crew decision-making in convective weather. The aircraft itself, repaired after the incident, returned to service. But among pilots, Taca Flight 110 became a legend the day a powerless jet landed with surgical precision on an unmarked field, guided not by instruments or automation, but by judgment, instinct, and composure. Today, the grassy levee where it touched down is still there, and pilots still refer to the event when discussing total engine failures. It remains one of the purest demonstrations of what defines aviation at its core. When technology fails, skill takes over. It was the night of February 16, 1998. Taiwan was drenched in monsoon rain, and the city of Taoyuan glowed faintly through a shroud of low clouds. China Airlines Flight 676, an Airbus A300, was descending toward Chiang Kai-shek International Airport, now known as Taoyuan International, after a routine flight from Bali. On board were 196 passengers and crew. The weather was poor, visibility was dropping, and the airport was surrounded by darkness, broken only by the glow of streetlights below. Inside the cockpit, everything was running according to plan. Captain Ko Ching Kwang, a veteran pilot with over 10,000 hours of experience, was flying the approach. The aircraft was cleared for landing on runway 05 left, but the weather was worsening rapidly. Heavy rain, strong crosswinds, and shifting visibility. The crew was already below the minimums for a visual approach, relying entirely on their instruments. As the Airbus descended through 1,000 feet, the pilots realized they were slightly above the glide path. The captain disconnected the autopilot and decided to continue manually. The aircraft began to sink below the desired descent rate, so the first officer called out the correction. But within seconds, the ground proximity warning system began to announce, "Sink rate, sink rate." The captain pulled up, but the engines were still at low power, and the speed began to decay. Realizing the approach was unstable, the captain decided to go around. He pressed the toga takeoff, go-around switch, which should have commanded the engines to full thrust and pitch the aircraft upward. But in the confusion of the moment, the autopilot's go-around mode did not fully engage. The thrust increased, but the autopilot remained in approach mode, trying to maintain altitude instead of climbing. The result? Conflicting inputs between the pilot and the computer, a tug-of-war over control. The aircraft momentarily climbed, then began to pitch sharply upward. Airspeed dropped dangerously fast. The first officer called out, "Speed!" But before any correction could be made, the captain pushed forward, attempting to lower the nose. The aircraft, caught between modes, responded unpredictably. It rolled slightly right, then left, its nose oscillating as the crew struggled to stabilize it. At 4:42 p.m., just as the aircraft broke through the low clouds, its nose pitched down sharply, too much, too fast. The Airbus slammed into a residential area less than half a mile from the runway. The impact created a fireball that lit up the rain-soaked night, destroying several houses. All 196 people on board were killed, along with 7 people on the ground. The tragedy was captured by airport surveillance cameras, showing the final seconds of descent lights disappearing into darkness. Then a sudden flash. Rescue teams arrived within minutes, but were met with intense flames, fueled by jet fuel and collapsing homes. The investigation by Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council uncovered a sequence of automation confusion and human factors that, together, created a fatal chain reaction. The autopilot had not been properly disengaged during the go-around attempt, leaving the system partially active while the pilots manually tried to climb. This dual control input caused erratic pitch movements that ultimately led to loss of control. The report also revealed fatigue among the flight crew, inadequate go-around training, and a failure to adhere to standard operating procedures. The captain, though experienced, had attempted to recover the approach instead of executing a stabilized, missed approach from the beginning, a decision influenced by time pressure, weather, and the desire to complete the landing after a long flight. In the aftermath, China Airlines faced intense scrutiny. The airline's training program was overhauled, with renewed emphasis on crew resource management, go-around discipline, and automation mode awareness. Pilots were retrained to treat any unstable approach, no matter how close to the ground, as a mandatory go-around situation. The accident also prompted Airbus and the broader aviation community to improve cockpit interface design. Mode confusion, where pilots are uncertain which automation mode is active, had already contributed to multiple crashes in the 1,990 seconds. Following Flight 676, the Flight Mode Annunciator, FMA, displays on Airbus aircraft were enhanced to make mode transitions clearer. The tragedy also changed the way pilots are trained to handle missed approaches at night and in poor weather. Instead of relying on partial automation, modern procedures now call for either full automation or full manual control, never both at the same time. Today, the site of the crash has been rebuilt. New houses stand where wreckage once burned, and a small memorial marks the loss. For many in Taiwan, the name Flight 676 is still synonymous with one of the darkest nights in the nation's aviation history. And yet, in every cockpit checklist, every simulator go-around, the echoes of that flight remain. Because what doomed the Airbus was not a single failure. It was a moment when humans and machines stopped understanding each other. It is the most haunting lesson of all. When the sky is dark, clarity must come from within. At 35,000 feet, the night sky looks infinite, a black ocean stretching to every horizon. Yet for pilots, it's not the stars they follow, it's the lights below. A thin line of runway lamps, a steady glow of approach beacons. They are the signals that say, "You're home now. You've made it through the dark." For over a century, light has been the symbol of safety in aviation. From the very first grass airfields to today's mega hubs, every bulb, every reflection, every white center line tells a story of precision and trust. A pilot on final approach sees those lights not just as a guide, but as a promise that the chaos of weather, distance, and fatigue will end in control and safety. But light, like trust, can be deceiving. In the stories we've seen from Taipei to Lexington, from Guam to San Francisco, a single wrong light has led to confusion, hesitation, and tragedy. Pilots who trained for thousands of hours suddenly faced a moment when their eyes betrayed them, when darkness, distance, and fatigue conspired to make the familiar strange. Runway lights are designed with purpose: white for safety, red for warning, blue and green to define the boundaries of motion. And yet, when viewed from the air through rain, haze, or exhaustion, they blur together. Taxiways can look like runways. A closed strip can mimic an open one. Even the city beyond can sparkle in patterns that mislead a tired mind. The human eye, incredible as it is, was never meant to judge distance and direction through darkness at hundreds of miles per hour. That's why every one of these tragedies changed something. After Singapore Flight 6, new lighting codes were established to mark closed runways. After Comair 5191, stricter cross-verification rules were written for night operations. After Air Canada 759, airports installed brighter runway status lights and better taxiway markings. Every accident, every near miss, left behind a new standard, a new way to make sure that the lights we trust are never the ones that mislead us again. But the truth remains: technology can guide, automation can protect, yet the final judgment always belongs to the human at the controls. The light outside the window is only as safe as the understanding behind it. In aviation, the glow of a runway is more than infrastructure. It's a symbol of hope, of survival, of homecoming. But it's also a test, a reminder that clarity can vanish when you least expect it. Because in the end, flying is about faith, faith in machines, in procedures, and in ourselves. And sometimes, the hardest part of the journey isn't fighting the storm or the distance. It's knowing which light to follow. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Every like, every subscription helps us keep telling these true stories of the skies. Stories of courage, of failure, of lessons written in light. So if you haven't already, subscribe and join us, because there are still more skies to explore and more lights to trust.